we all need to make forecasts in the public sector, whether it's something relatively simple, like demand for services, or a police authority trying to work out how much petrol its cars are going to need. We all try to make forecasts and work out what's going to happen in the future for the organisation. So this week, we're very lucky to be joined by Michael Story, the co-founder of Maby, to talk about how we can improve our forecasting and how maybe we can get our forecasts a little bit more accurate, and if there are any techniques we can use to do that. So thanks very much for joining us, Michael. How are you? I understand you're in Taiwan at the moment, enjoying their quarantine procedures.
Yeah, I'm exactly 50% of the way through the mandatory quarantine on arrival. So this is my home for the last 7 days and will be my home for the next 7 as well. But yeah, otherwise it's pretty good. Three square meals and a cot, that's all you need.
So at least they so it's sort of like a very, very nice prison then, I suppose.
Yeah, extremely. Scandinavian level.
Right. Well, the first thing to say is that we're going to try something a little bit different, because obviously we are talking about forecasting this week. So we're going to run a small poll. Obviously now we're going to see if I can get this to work with ease. So So hopefully there is now a poll for you all to be involved in. So will happen to the cash and investment balances of the local authority sector as a whole in the next 12 months. So I'd like all of you to just have a vote on that. Do you think it's going to fall by more than 50%, fall by less than 50%, stay roughly the same, increase by more than 50%, or, oh no, and there's two, and the first problem there, I've got two increase by more. So obviously the first one of those should be increased by less than 50%. So if you stick your vote in. It is all anonymous. So and you can do that whilst we're talking. So it would be great if you all stick your votes in there. So I suppose whilst everybody's voting, Michael, I suppose the first question is what is forecasting? It's been in the news a lot with different people talking about it, criticisms of it. But I suppose, what is forecasting? Is it just about being good at guessing? I mean, can you improve at forecasting? What's it all about?
So forecasting is a bit of a disputed term, but I think normally people talk about forecasting in contrast to scenario-based thinking, right? So if you think about scenarios, you think about things that might happen and how they might happen, and the goal is to kind of stimulate your thinking and stimulate your preparedness and get you mentally prepared for something to occur. Forecasting is much more about trying to work out how likely specific scenarios are to occur. So being precise, creating a future a probability estimate of what's coming, of what's coming towards you, so that you can be prepared. So we're thinking about, scenarios more about what might happen. Forecasting is trying to estimate how likely things are to happen and give you a sense of where things are going to go in the future that allows you to make plans. Forecast isn't very useful unless you can plan around it. So the goal is to be as specific as possible. And the good litmus test really for is something a good forecast is, can we all agree on what happened later, right? If I make a forecast that's very vague, then it's not very useful because everyone's going to interpret it differently, and that didn't help us plan. So specific and probabilistic forecasting is what we're focused on.
So I suppose if we look at that, into our question that we've put in the chat, I suppose, as you say, the specific nature of it, we're asking, rather than saying will your investments be more than last year or fall or go up, we're actually asking to put them in a bucket. That would be, and that's sort of to assist planning. So if we sort of put a forecast in sort of a relatively strict bucket, that helps us plan around it.
Yeah, that's the idea, and it turns out that this sort of works, right? So you're saying about guessing, and of course there is a bit of guessing involved. But what we're doing here, I can see there are more votes coming in, which is really cool. That we're kind of doing something that that works pretty well, which is the wisdom of the crowd. And the principle behind the wisdom of the crowd is not necessarily that everybody in the crowd is very sensible, although I'm sure everybody on this call, is very sensible. But the idea is that when we make mistakes, we get things wrong. There is an element of randomness in our guessing. And the principle of something like this, right, of taking a poll of a group of people and using that to inform a forecast, is that, yeah, we'll all make little random mistakes, or there'll be little random elements of guessing involved in our thinking. But if you ask a group of people, well, all of those little random errors are going to be wrong in different directions, and they'll all cancel each other out. So if you take a poll from a group of people and look at the median estimate of a group, tends to be much more reliable than trying to identify any one person within that group to be your kind of forecasting champion. So this wisdom of crowds principle is quite a nice example. So just taking a poll gets you a very long way to more accurate forecasting. I think that's probably the big lesson of work that I've been involved in my career in forecasting is, yes, there are things you can do at the extreme level to get very, very high degree of accuracy, but it's very, very expensive. But there are some quite simple things that you can do that don't have a huge cost that can get you quite a lot of the way there. You can get pretty accurate stuff without needing to do some of these really complicated, expensive things.
So a good example was of something that public sector organisations can do straight away would be just to get more people involved when they, an example being, if you're trying to forecast demand for something, for a service, for example, perhaps, getting as many people in that service involved in making the forecast rather than leaving it down to, one or two members of staff who then present, the forecast of demand, or the same with, treasury and finance functions. If you're making a forecast about where the cash reserves, the cash levels are going to be, or the investment levels are going to be, getting as many people involved in that process as well.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And that is something that we've seen. So it's often the case in organizations that information is much more widely distributed than people realize. So there's a typical organization has people with areas of responsibility that they know really well. But it's quite often the case that there are little important things that are not known to everybody that might be known to people who are, they might know something about an area that is not their main function, but they probably have some little piece of information knocking about that might be useful. So they might not be able to give the whole answer, but they know a piece of it. So the more people you involve, generally, the more accurate you get. It's unlikely that you'll get less accurate if you grow the size of the group of people who are contributing because of this distributed information. So you tend to find that there are lots of little tidbits that are actually very important that just get spread around lots of people. And the more people who have input, the more likely your forecast is to be accurate, depending on how you do it, right? You don't want to have a free for all where you're sort of shouting at each other or whatever. Obviously that's not good. But if you're doing something like this, like a poll where everybody contributes equally, then yeah, the more the better generally.
Brilliant. I mean, so if our first lesson is get as many people involved as possible, what other techniques can we use to improve our forecasts? Are there things that people who are good at forecasting tend to do that we can copy? Or is there and are there things that we can look at, to replicate people who are very accurate forecasters, so that we can improve our forecasts on top of just having more people?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, there's really kind of 4 key things that you can do. So, I should say, so in my background was being part of something called the Good Judgment Project, which was a team that competed in forecasting competitions in the United States, run by the intelligence community there. And we won all of those tournaments by basically focusing in 4 areas. So, and some of these are more structural and some of them more individual. But the basic 4 principles that we found to be helpful were to identify accurate forecasters. So there are some people who are naturally a bit better at this type of thinking than others. But also to give people training and support. So there are things you can do, so we'll talk about in a moment. Also, there are structural things like this, inviting lots of people to contribute, kind of teaming components, getting people to work together as a team. That's really important. Teams outperform individuals in forecasting nearly all the time because of this distributed information issue. And also making sure that we put things together in a sensible way. So use proper polling, use proper anonymized voting and things like that. So there's this kind of structural elements, and then there are these individual elements. And so if you're forecasting on your own, then of course, you've got to think about things individually. And there are a few things to think about there, which are characteristic of the better forecasters. Basically, the most important thing, the most important intervention that we found when we explored interventions and looked to see if people's forecasts got more accurate or less accurate, people tended to get more accurate when they were invited to think of things from the outside perspective, right? The external view. Think as broadly as you possibly can. So if we look at our question here today, we're asking about these cash and investment balances. So the temptation when you're presented with a question like that is to focus very narrowly on the absolute specifics of the topic, right? So think about the mechanisms by which your balance is going to go up and down. Think about the specific effects that you're aware of. But it's really, really good habit to get into if you can broaden your approach as far as possible. So think about the last 20 years and think about, have there been any occasions where you've seen a fall of more than 50%? How often has that happened? And then try to look at the circumstances where that has happened before. That might not have happened before, and that doesn't mean to say it won't happen. New things happen all the time. But looking out, looking broadly, looking at, for example, other countries, other years, other decades, other types of other bodies, and looking at their budgets, looking as broadly as you can help ground you and avoid you getting reading too much into the kind of narrow specifics of the situation that you're in. So that's a really, really, really good habit to get into, is this broad outside view thinking. And then, of course, thinking about the inside view and thinking about the kind of specifics of the thing you're looking at. But start out and narrow in is a very, very good prompt to have in your mind when you're thinking about something like this.
Brilliant. I mean, so if we take that as a sort of a prompt for our listeners to think about their forecast, if we go to where we were, at the start of the session, we've got 23% of people think that it'll fall by more than 50%. 50% of people will think it'll still fall, but by less than 50%. And people think that it'll stay roughly the same. And actually, 5% of people think that it'll increase by some amount. So if we apply that technique to this question, we'd say, well, actually, investment balances in the UK public sector, well, not public sector, sorry, cash balances in the sector as a whole have actually been increasing the last 10 years. So would that be a good place to start our thinking then? Well, if they've been increasing generally over the last 10 years, obviously that can't happen forever. But if our base rate is increasing, how would that affect our thinking?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. So obviously 2020 is an unusual year. So you can't forecast 2020 by saying look at what's happened over the last decade, because there have been lots of deviations for that, of course. But the value in paying attention to that is to look for other unusual things that might have happened in the past. So things like the financial crisis, or it's obviously slightly more than a decade ago, but those type of events, and look at the severity of the impact and try and compare to historical events as much as you can. But of course, we can't do that perfectly, right? Things don't repeat perfectly. If they did, there'd be no role for human forecasters. And we know that human forecasters are really important when we're trying to judge things like this. And humans are particularly good at forecasting when we're in an unusual situation, because we don't have years and years of data, and we can just do a model. We can't do that for something like this. So the human judgment element is much more important. But the goal really is to try and look broadly at try and identify. Have there been any years when the available investment amount has gone down? How and what did those years look like, and how similar did those look to where we are now? So I'm not saying exactly copy those circumstances, but that's where to start to look for clues and try and identify something that might be similar, that can give you a bit of a hint to get you moving in the right direction.
Great. I mean, obviously we've talked about, ways that we can improve our forecasts. Are there any sort of common mistakes to avoid? When we're thinking about trying to forecast what's going to happen, and we're thinking about quite specific questions. We've used the example of our question today, but there's other examples of things that need to be the public sector probably does a uniquely large amount of forecasting because it's so demand led. Are there some common mistakes that we all fall into, or the public sector falls into, that we can try and avoid, and that'll improve our forecasts and allow better planning?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You raise a really good point about the public sector, because we do work with the public and private sector, and the thing that we really notice about public sector forecasting is that there are difficult things to forecast, and the reaction often of the private sector is just to try and stay away from them. If there's a risk of something going wrong, they'll just try and avoid it completely. And in the public sector, you basically can't, because those are the things that ultimately fall to the public sector to deal with. You can't just say, well, let's try and move our business away so we're not exposed to that risk, because ultimately, the public sector is that is whose responsibility is to deal with those risks. So there are a lot more serious risks falling into the public sector area than there are privately. So the burden of forecasting is that much greater, just because of the nature of the problems that you're dealing with. But yeah, there are some common problems. I mean, the biggest one is a kind of structural one, which is when you're forecasting, the most important thing to do is to keep track of your forecasts and to learn from what you've done previously. So for today, we're doing this poll, which is great. What will be very useful is to look at this 12 months from now and see what happened, and see whether the confidence that people showed in their forecast was justified. And that really is the only way to learn. So the number one mistake that I see made is not really keeping score. And you would be very surprised, or so I was certainly quite surprised, by some organizations that don't actually keep score, because it's quite difficult to do, and it's a bit of a emotional challenge to do that, to look back and really honestly assess whether you were right or not. But keeping score is probably the most important thing. But when you're making your forecasts, there are some common biases and problems that people can run into. So one thing that people find very difficult is thinking about scale, and thinking about the kind of scope and scale of their forecast. So what we tend to do when we think about whether something's going to happen is we develop a kind of general sense of probability about whether that thing will happen or not. What we find very difficult is to have a sense of how big that thing is. So, for example, if you were thinking about your investment balance, right, your cash investment balance, you might have a sense that is going to go down or go up, but it's much harder to assess by how much, right? That's a harder skill that can be learnt and can be trained, but it's much harder to do that. And so what people often do is get a little bit caught by not really being precise about scale, and that could happen in two ways. In terms of time scale, so often if you ask people, how likely do you think something is going to be, how likely are we to experience this problem in the next year, and then you ask them, how likely are we to experience this problem in the next decade? Well, everything else being equal, it should be 10 times as likely that we experience a problem over a 10-year horizon than over a 1-year horizon. But you tend not to see that reflected in the forecast. Often people, have a vague sense of that thing is going to happen, but the time scale is very hard to be precise about, or how bad that thing is, right? If you're thinking about a risk, you might be, looking at how many people are going to be a victim of a terrorist attack. You can sort of vaguely predict that there might be a terrorist attack, but again, it's much harder to be precise. So if you said a terrorist attack that kills 50 people, well, those happen quite frequently. A terrorist attack that kills 500 people is very rare. But again, you don't tend to see, when we look at surveys of forecasts about something like terrorist attacks, that as the scale of the event goes up, the probability should go down, but often it doesn't, because people find that very difficult. Now, the solution to that problem is to force yourself to think at different scales. So when we look at this question here, you've got 5 options, right? Which is more than 50% full, less than 50% full, stay roughly the same, and then up to 50% and above 50% increase. So that's pretty useful. If you wanted to be more precise when you're thinking about something like that, you can create your own version of that question to ask yourself. So what would my answer be if it was not fall by more than 50%, but fall by just 10%? Well, strictly speaking, it should be more likely that it will fall by 10% than by 50%, right? It's a smaller deviation. But does my forecast reflect that? Like, would I be as confident? Would I be as sure of myself if I were asking, a slightly different question? And by doing that, by asking yourself the same question and sort of varying the scale and scope yourself, you can sort of feel out whether you are suffering from that problem and whether there's something that you haven't thought of. So the trick is to ask yourself around the question. So if you're asking for a 12-month forecast, ask yourself what your 2-year forecast would be, or your 6-month forecast. And if you find that they're the same as your 1 year, then that's a sign that you maybe need to think again.
So a good example of that might be if you were trying to forecast demand for adult social care or demand for homelessness services. So if you thought, well, we think there's and you're trying to look at the budget pressures on those things, trying to think about, well, I've got a budget of however many £1 million, it may need to increase by 10%. Actually thinking, well, how likely do I think it is to increase by 5% or by 15%, and actually think around some of those things. And I think probably the people who look at budgets and people who do management accounts who are listening will probably think to themselves, well, there's probably it's almost 90% that sort of thing would increase at least sort of 1 or 2%. And so maybe that would help them think, well, actually, the idea that it's going to increase by 5%, maybe I should up my forecast and try and think about it like that. Is that sort of, am I on the right track?
Absolutely. Sure, yeah, absolutely. I think just asking yourself, what would I think if I were trying to think about something slightly different, and just testing your sensitivity to the scale of what you're being asked. So, if someone's saying to you, we're going to have 10% extra provision for whatever it is, next year, is that going to be sufficient? So then you've got to think, okay, what if I was being asked 20%? How confident would I be? So does my confidence go up and down with the scale? And it should, and that is a muscle that you can train, right? So if you keep track of your forecast and you find that you're able to do this, you will improve. And that's another really good tip when you're making estimates like that, is to write yourself what we call a pre-mortem. So think about why you might have been wrong. So think about, if I've got this wrong, why was I most likely to be wrong? And make a note of the countervailing argument. So if you said that you thought that the likely outcome was that there'd be a greater than 50% fall in the cash investment balances, then try and imagine a world in which it went perhaps the other way. There was a 50% increase, or even just stayed roughly the same, or a different answer turned out to be correct, and think about why it might be that happened, even though you think that that's not going to happen. So what is it that you might be wrong about, And what that helps you do is think about the assumptions that are underlying your forecast. So if you voted for a more than 50% fall, you might be basing that on, well, there are, these are the kind of 3 most important reasons I think that's right. And if it doesn't do that, it's probably because I was wrong about one of those 3 things. And it can prompt you to think about which one of those 3 things you are least confident in. Now, that doesn't mean that you change your answer, but it's a very good habit to get into, thinking, what is the weakest part of my assessment? If it turns out to be wrong, what will I have been wrong about? Which of my assumptions is the one that I'm least certain of?
And I suppose if we're looking at sort of the things that we can practically do, I mean, we've talked about getting more people involved. We've talked about making sure you've got a good sense of scale, and we've now talked about the idea of sort of a pre-mortem, making sure that you've got that. But you also talked about keeping score, and I suppose I would like to talk a little bit more about that, in the sense that is a big part of it. One of the reasons, surely, I can understand to keep score is if you've got a forecast wildly wrong, actually sort of looking at that and saying, well, why did we get that wrong? And trying to work out where the mistakes were made, or I mean, if you'd have tried to make a forecast this year for the UK local government finances, for example, you'd have been wrong because of coronavirus. But that isn't really a failure of forecasting. That's just
Indeed.
You're always gonna these things are always gonna happen. So actually, you could have made a good forecast, but actually events have just overtaken you. So how can you've talked about pre-mortem, but also how can we have better post-mortems, if you like? How can we analyze our old forecasts a little bit better? And I'm actually thinking about this from an Arling Close point of view. One of the big things that we provide our clients with is an interest rate forecast, where we forecast where UK base rates are going to be. And we've actually had I'm not going to blow our own trumpet too much, but we've had a very, very good record of interest rate forecasting. So it's been interesting to hear some of the things you've been talking about, and the ones we do use, and perhaps the ones that we don't use. But as I say, sort of thinking about postmortems, what do we make sure that we sort of analyse when we're looking at our old forecasts?
Well, it's very good to see if you were wrong, but for a good reason. But it's also really good to make sure that you weren't right for a terrible reason, right? Like you could have come up with some really wacky scenario that there was going to be, a big problem in local government financing this year for some totally different reason, and then COVID caused that to happen, and you think, oh look, my forecast came true. But if it was for a completely different reason than the one you thought, then yes, you can get credit for having forecast it, but it's you got lucky, right? So it's very important to see whether, even if you get it right, you might have also been lucky. So it's good to review your correct forecasts as well as the ones you got wrong, just to make sure there wasn't something shaky. But yes, that's really important. I mean, the big danger really is, unless you're relatively systematic about reviewing your old forecasts, it's very, very hard from memory to know whether your forecasts are any good and really to improve, because what often happens is you can kind of swing around, you can sort of over adjust and be wrong again. So if you remember, my last, interest rate forecast was too low, then next time I end up forecasting too high. Well, I might be just as wrong, but I'm just as wrong, the other side of what actually happened. So it's very, very difficult to do, and hindsight bias is incredibly powerful. If you ever play poker or things like that, people always say when flops revealed, and people will go, I knew that, and I was so sure that person had such and such a card, and they'll say, hey, of course they weren't that sure, right? But it was one of maybe 10 scenarios they had in their mind, and the other 9 instantly get forgotten. And that one that, if I'd only bet on that thing I was thinking, I would have been better off. And you see that all the time. So it's very, very hard to use your memory to assess what you thought. So you have to be quite systematic and quite rigorous, and go back and look at what you've done before. And I think the key thing also is to assess the assumptions behind it. So that's why when you record a forecast, it's very useful if we can say, what do we all think? So today, we're looking at what people think is likely to happen, but it's very, very useful if you can collect just a couple of sentences on why people think that, because often, you might be wrong for the right reasons or right for the wrong reasons, and those couple of sentences will help you figure that out, and that helps you learn faster. Because what we find in forecasting is, as soon as you start keeping score, and as soon as you start tracking these things, people improve because they get feedback. If you give people structured feedback that is really rigorous and specific, then of course people improve. We're a learning species. That's what we do. We optimize and learn for the feedback that we're given. So if you find, with your interest rate forecasting, that over the years you've got a nice block of data to look at, you can review it and see where you were, see what your assumptions were, see if those assumptions bore out. And what you're doing when you record assumptions and then review them later is you're increasing the opportunity to learn and increasing the number of things that you can review to assess your own thinking. So if all you have is, I forecast the interest rate would be X, and it turned out that it was Y, and I was wrong, well, that's quite helpful. But if you'd written 3 or 4 sentences saying why you thought that, and then you can then go and assess all of those as well, that's like 3 or 4 more data points that you can put into refining your next forecast, because you now have this extra opportunity to learn and improve your own thinking. So keeping score in advance is really important. and reviewing, right? The post-morteming, thinking about why I was right, why I was wrong, what I can do differently next time. And people do just tend to respond pretty favorably to that. If you put people in an environment where they're given that feedback, they just tend to improve over time, because they'll learn. We do just learn when we get that feedback.
Great. Well, I mean, I think this is probably a good time to chuck in our second poll, and we can just talk around some of the things. So we're going to try a different system to do it. My colleague Perry is going to put a form in, so hopefully you'll be able to click on this. So for those of you who didn't get a chance to put in the question to answer the question last time, please do answer again. And if you did answer originally, please do make sure you click on the poll. So vote now on the form. Hopefully it will work. So thinking about some of the things we've discussed, obviously we're doing the right thing. We've got a broad number of people and talking about things, but maybe we can talk about some of that pre-mortem. So beforehand, everybody pretty much thought that the investments would fall by less than 50%. Some of the reasons or at least the majority thought it would fall. So thinking about some of the things that might make that wrong would be obviously the base rate you were talking about, that generally actually cash investments have increased. Something that happened today, which is that the amount that local government can borrow at has reduced from central government. So actually it's cheaper for local authorities to take on cash than it was long term. So they may choose to take on some more cash over the next 12 months because it's so cheap. Not something that we would advise, but as a sector, it's certainly possible. I suppose another thing that may change is that local authority investments are quite high at the moment because a lot of grants are being provided via local government. Now, a lot of our clients may be thinking, oh, actually, you know what, that may fall out. But it may be that actually that gets used even more over the next 18 months, and central government try and use that to use local government as an agent, and actually the cash that they're getting from central government increases. So we've had a few responses. So if we just quickly go back to our original poll, which obviously had only a few people, we had 23% thought it would fall by more than 50, 47 thought it would fall by than less than 50, and 23% thought it would stay roughly the same, with the remainder thinking that'd be some form of increase. We're still getting responses, but now we've seen quite a bit of a reduction. Only 15% think that it'll fall by more than 50% now. The majority, a big majority now, 65% think that it'll fall by less than 50%. Around 15% think they'll stay roughly the same, and we've got the same 5% thinking that the stubborn 5% that think that it'll actually increase by less than 50%. So we've seen our forecast very much sort of congregate around that fall by less than 50%. So that's quite interesting that just through the conversation, people have changed their votes. I know we've got a few more voters because unfortunately some people couldn't vote at the beginning, but it does seem to have changed the view of the crowd. So what would be great actually is to have you on in November 2021, and perhaps we could see what happened and do a little bit of a post-mortem on maybe what our listeners got right, what our listeners got wrong. You know, did they fall? You know, did they increase? You know, we're getting more votes in, and it's fall by less than 50% is increasing its lead. So, and also it might be
very
fun,
interesting.
Yeah. It also might be fun to see if to take a look at Arlene Close's interest rate forecast from November 2020 in a year's time, and we can maybe do a little bit of a public dissection of our own forecasts and see how successful we've been. Yeah, I mean, thanks very much for joining us, Michael. I found it very interesting, and hopefully everybody else has. I think now's a very good time to call an end to it. But thank you very much. I feel like I've learned a lot. Next week we're going to be having a webcast regarding the Public Works Loan Board consultation outcome that I just mentioned. So do make sure that you all tune in for that. Also, we're always updating our Twitter and LinkedIn presence, so publishing articles on our website. So please do make sure you're checking that. All that really leaves me to say is thank everybody for listening, and also thank you, Michael, for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It's been really interesting to think about these things, and always love to talk about forecasting. So delighted to be here. Thank you.